In a region defined by distance, silence, and routine, danger was never supposed to arrive. The Scottish Highlands exist as a contradiction to modern life, a landscape so vast and empty that the concept of threat feels almost absurd. Here, visibility extends for miles in every direction. Roads cut through valleys with such clarity that a single vehicle can be spotted long before it arrives. Communities are small enough that faces become familiar through repetition alone, and the rhythm of daily life follows patterns established over generations. This is not a place where anonymity exists. It is not a place where strangers go unnoticed. It is not a place where violence finds fertile ground. Yet something happened here that changed everything, not because it was dramatic or sudden, but because it revealed a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. What happened here wasn't sudden. It was unseen. The Highlands operate on a principle that urban environments abandoned long ago: trust through familiarity. When the same people walk the same paths at the same times each day, when the same cars pass through the same villages at predictable intervals, when the same voices answer the same phones in the same shops, a collective consciousness forms. This consciousness doesn't require documentation or surveillance. It exists in the shared awareness of routine, in the subtle recognition of what belongs and what doesn't. In cities, safety comes from systems, from cameras and protocols and rapid response times. In the Highlands, safety comes from something more fundamental: the belief that everyone knows everyone, and that this knowledge itself provides protection. This belief is not irrational. For decades, it proved accurate. Crime rates in remote Highland communities remained among the lowest in the United Kingdom. Violent crime was virtually non-existent. The occasional theft or dispute made headlines precisely because such events were so rare. The landscape itself seemed to enforce a kind of natural order. With so few places to hide, with so much open ground between settlements, with such limited routes of escape, the Highlands appeared to be self-policing. The environment created transparency. Transparency created safety, or so everyone believed, but transparency only works when someone is watching. In a region where populations are measured in dozens rather than thousands, where the nearest police station might be 40 miles away, where mobile phone signals vanish in valley bottoms and mountain shadows, the act of watching becomes selective. People notice what aligns with expectation. They register familiar patterns and dismiss unfamiliar ones as temporary anomalies. A stranger passing through draws brief curiosity but rarely sustained attention. After all, tourists are common. Hikers are expected. Vehicles traveling to remote locations are assumed to have legitimate purposes because the alternative seems unlikely. Why would someone come here to commit a crime when cities offer so many more opportunities, so many more targets, so much easier access to whatever they might seek? The question itself reinforced the illusion of safety. The Highlands were protected not by walls or guards, but by their own apparent irrelevance to criminal intent. This assumption, repeated so often that it became invisible, created a vulnerability that no one recognized until it was far too late. The very qualities that made residents feel secure, the emptiness and the familiarity, had transformed into weaknesses that went entirely unacknowledged until the moment they were exploited. The geography of the Highlands imposes itself on everything. Mountains rise from sea level to over 4,000 feet within the span of a few miles. Valleys carved by ancient glaciers create corridors where settlements cluster, separated from one another by terrain that remains largely unchanged since the last ice age. Roads don't follow straight lines here. They curve around locks, climb mountain passes, narrow to single track with passing places marked by small, rectangular signs. Journey times are measured not just in distance but in conditions, in weather, in the season. A trip that takes 40 minutes in summer daylight can double in winter darkness, when snow obscures the road and ice makes every turn dangerous. This relationship with geography shapes everything about life in the region. People plan around distance. They shop in bulk because stores are far apart. They schedule appointments with buffer time because delays are expected. They maintain vehicles with care because breaking down in certain areas means waiting hours for assistance. This adaptation to remoteness creates resilience, but it also creates acceptance. People accept that help will take time to arrive. They accept that services available elsewhere simply don't exist here. They accept that isolation is the price paid for beauty and tranquility. And in accepting these conditions, they also accept the vulnerabilities that come with them. The communities scattered throughout the Highlands developed their character over centuries. Many began as farming settlements, others as fishing villages, still others as waypoints along drove roads where cattle were herded to market. History sits visibly in the landscape. Abandoned croft houses dot hillsides, their stone walls slowly returning to the earth. Kirk graveyards hold generations of the same families, surnames repeating across centuries of weathered headstones. The population has shifted over time, diminished by clearances and economic necessity, but those who remain carry deep connections to place. These aren't people who moved to the Highlands seeking escape or retirement. They are people whose families have occupied the same glens for longer than written records can confirm. This rootedness creates social cohesion that outsiders often find remarkable. Neighbors help without being asked. Communities organize around shared needs, from volunteer fire services to community-run shops. Trust operates as the default setting, not because people are naive, but because experience has taught them that cooperation is essential when formal infrastructure is sparse. In this environment, reputation matters profoundly. Behavior is visible in ways that city life never allows. A person's character becomes known through accumulated interactions over years and decades. This social transparency reinforces the sense of safety. People believe they know who poses risk and who doesn't, that dangerous individuals would reveal themselves through behavior long before they could cause harm. Nothing about this place prepared anyone for what came next. The routines continued as they always had. Morning light spread across the hills at its seasonal angle. Vehicles moved along familiar routes. Doors opened and closed at expected times. The radio carried weather forecasts and local news, traffic reports for distant cities that felt irrelevant to daily life here. Conversations in shops covered the same topics they always did: weather, livestock prices, upcoming community events, family news. There was no sense of foreboding, no atmospheric change that signaled disruption. The day began as every other day had begun, with the quiet confidence that comes from living in a place where tomorrow will look almost identical to today. This predictability is both comfort and trap. It allows people to move through life without constant vigilance, to lower defenses that would be essential in less stable environments. But it also creates blindness to possibility. When every day reinforces the same patterns, the mind stops scanning for deviation. Attention becomes habitual rather than active. People see what they expect to see and filter out information that doesn't fit established narratives. This cognitive efficiency works perfectly until the moment it fails catastrophically. The person who entered this landscape understood its rhythms better than most residents realized. This was not someone passing through randomly, making opportunistic choices based on chance encounters. This was someone who had studied the environment, who recognized how trust and routine created openings, who understood that remoteness offered advantages that crowded places could never provide. The initial appearance was entirely unremarkable. Nothing about the presentation suggested threat. Clothing was appropriate, behavior was normal, interactions were polite and forgettable. In the handful of places where contact occurred, in shops or petrol stations or passing encounters on narrow roads, the impression left behind was neutral to positive. There was no intensity, no peculiarity that would lodge in memory. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect when examined later. There were no obvious warning signs, no moments that should have triggered alarm. The individual moved through spaces designed to notice outsiders and did so without generating the kind of attention that leads to later recall. This wasn't luck, it was deliberate calibration, an understanding of how to present oneself in ways that align with expectation, that generate just enough interaction to seem normal, but not so much as to become memorable. The background that later emerged revealed a life marked by transience. Employment history showed frequent job changes, always with plausible explanations. Residences shifted between regions, never staying long enough to establish deep connections, but always maintaining enough stability to avoid appearing rootless in problematic ways. Relationships existed but remained superficial, characterized by acquaintances rather than close bonds. This pattern of shallow engagement across multiple contexts created a kind of invisibility. When later questioned, people who had known this individual struggled to provide detailed descriptions. Everyone remembered the encounters, but no one could articulate specifics. The person remained a vague presence, someone who had been there without truly being known. This quality, the ability to occupy space without leaving a strong impression, proved crucial. It allowed movement between locations without generating the suspicion that more distinctive individuals might have triggered. It created a buffer of anonymity even in places where anonymity supposedly didn't exist. The Highlands exposed newcomers simply by virtue of their newness, but this exposure only matters if the newcomer stands out in ways that demand attention. Someone who understands how to blend, who can mirror local mannerisms and respect unspoken social codes, can move through even small communities without generating the kind of scrutiny that might reveal ulterior purpose. The isolation that defines the Highlands creates a specific set of vulnerabilities that urban-focused policing strategies never adequately address. When major incidents occur in cities, resources converge rapidly. Officers arrive within minutes. Specialists deploy from nearby headquarters. Communication networks coordinate response across multiple units simultaneously. The system is designed for density, optimized for environments where backup is always close, where witnesses are abundant, where surveillance infrastructure provides multiple data streams that can be analyzed and cross-referenced. This model works brilliantly where it was designed to work, but it falters in places where none of those assumptions hold true. The Highland Police Service operates across an area larger than some European countries, serving a population that would barely fill a medium-sized town. Officers work alone or in pairs, covering territories so vast that responding to calls can mean driving for an hour before reaching the location. Backup, when it exists, comes from equally distant positions. This geography imposes brutal mathematics on emergency response. Every minute spent traveling is a minute lost from intervention. Every mile between the incident and the nearest officer is a mile that expands the window of opportunity for harm to occur unchallenged. Communication infrastructure in remote regions adds another layer of difficulty. Mobile phone coverage remains patchy despite decades of infrastructure investment. Valleys block signals, mountains create dead zones. Even satellite phones can fail in certain conditions, when weather interferes with transmission or when terrain creates angles that prevent clear connection to orbiting receivers. Landlines exist but are increasingly rare as households abandon them in favor of mobile technology that works inconsistently at best. This communication fragility means that calling for help is not always possible, that establishing what has happened and where requires time that may not be available. Radio communication among emergency services functions better than public networks, but still faces limitations. Repeater stations extend range but can't overcome all geographic barriers. Officers working in certain areas accept that they will be out of contact for portions of their shift. that they are functionally alone until they return to zones where signals reach. This isolation affects decision-making. Knowing that backup cannot arrive quickly changes how situations are approached. Caution becomes necessary in ways that urban officers might not fully comprehend. The confidence that comes from knowing help is minutes away doesn't exist here. Every interaction carries the awareness that if something goes wrong, there will be no rapid intervention, no cavalry coming over the hill. The systems designed to detect and prevent serious crime rely heavily on information sharing and pattern recognition. When multiple agencies contribute data to centralized databases, when incidents are logged and analyzed for connections, when intelligence units identify trends that suggest escalating risk, the system functions as intended. But this model requires consistent reporting, comprehensive coverage, and the kind of bureaucratic coordination that works best when everyone operates within similar frameworks using comparable resources. In remote regions, these conditions often don't exist. Small police stations may have only a handful of officers, all of whom are occupied with immediate operational demands rather than administrative tasks. Reporting takes time, and time is the resource in shortest supply. Patterns that might emerge from comprehensive data analysis remain invisible when data entry is inconsistent or delayed. Intelligence that could inform proactive policing never gets generated because the foundational information never makes it into the systems designed to process it. This isn't failure at the individual level. Officers in Highland communities work with dedication and skill, often going far beyond formal job requirements to serve the populations they protect. But dedication cannot overcome structural limitations. When the system itself is calibrated for urban environments, when resources are allocated based on population density rather than geographic coverage, when training and protocols assume conditions that don't exist in remote areas, even the most committed professionals face constraints that fundamentally limit what can be achieved. The event that shattered the routine began with absence. Someone expected at a specific time didn't arrive. A phone call went unanswered. These small deviations triggered concern among people who knew the individual, who understood their patterns well enough to recognize when something was wrong. Initial responses followed familiar scripts. More phone calls were placed, messages were sent. Neighbors were contacted to ask if anyone had seen anything unusual. These efforts consumed the first hour, then the second. As time passed without resolution, concern deepened into worry. The person was reliable. They didn't simply disappear without explanation. They maintained schedules, communicated plans, followed through on commitments. Their absence was not just unexpected but fundamentally wrong, a break in pattern so significant that it demanded investigation. By the time formal authorities were contacted, several hours had already elapsed. This delay is often criticized in retrospect, but the criticism misunderstands how people process anomalies in low-risk environments. When serious crime is rare, the mind doesn't immediately jump to worst-case scenarios. It searches for benign explanations first. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about timing. Perhaps a vehicle broke down in an area without phone signal. Perhaps a minor emergency arose that prevented normal communication. These explanations felt more plausible than darker alternatives because they aligned with experience. Nothing in the collective memory of the community suggested that violence was a realistic possibility. When police were finally notified, the response followed standard protocols. Initial assessment established basic facts: who was missing, when they were last seen, what their planned activities had been, whether there were any known issues, health problems, or reasons they might have chosen to disappear voluntarily. These questions, while necessary, consumed additional time. Once the decision was made to treat the situation as a potential emergency, mobilization began. Officers were dispatched from the nearest station over 30 miles away. The journey took 40 minutes along winding single-track roads. Daylight was already fading, and with it went the advantages of visibility that the landscape normally provided. Darkness in the Highlands is absolute. Without streetlights or ambient urban glow, without the reflective surfaces of buildings and pavement, the night becomes impenetrable beyond the reach of vehicle headlights. Searching in these conditions is nearly impossible without specialized equipment and trained personnel, neither of which were immediately available. The first officers on scene began with what they could do: interviews with family and friends, reconstruction of the timeline, identification of the last known location. This investigative work was essential, but it wasn't searching, it wasn't combing terrain or following trails. It was information gathering, the foundation for a search effort that couldn't truly begin until morning. Volunteers organized quickly, as they always do in Highland communities. Word spread through phone trees and social media. People who had never met the missing person showed up because this was what neighbors did. They brought thermoses of tea, high-visibility vests salvaged from personal vehicles, torches with batteries of questionable age. Their willingness to help was absolute, but their effectiveness was limited. Searching vast terrain in darkness without coordination or training risks creating additional emergencies. Well-meaning volunteers can become lost themselves, can disturb evidence, can trigger rescue efforts that divert resources from the primary mission. Police coordinated as best they could, establishing a command post, dividing the area into search zones, but the scope of the task was overwhelming. Hundreds of square miles of mountains, forests, moorland, and water. Countless places where someone could be, whether by choice or circumstance. The volunteers spread out with determination, but the mathematics were brutal. Too much space, too few people, too little light. As the night wore on without discovery, hope began to strain against reality. The temperature dropped toward freezing. Wind carried rain across the hills. Exposure became a concern even for the searchers themselves. By midnight, the decision was made to suspend the search until dawn, to regroup and launch a more organized effort when visibility returned. Morning brought reinforcements. Police from neighboring divisions arrived to supplement local resources. Mountain rescue teams deployed with proper equipment and training. A helicopter was requested, though weather conditions made deployment uncertain. The search area was reassessed based on overnight analysis and additional interviews. New information narrowed the focus somewhat, identifying likely routes and destinations based on the missing person's known activities and statements. The effort became more systematic, more professional, but the underlying challenge remained unchanged. The landscape was simply too large, too complex, too filled with places where someone could be concealed, either deliberately or by accident. Searchers moved in lines across hillsides, checking behind boulders and in drainage cuts, calling out and listening for responses. The work was exhausting, physically demanding in ways that sustained focus makes even more difficult. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then began its descent. Another night approached, with nothing found. This pattern repeated. Each day brought renewed effort. Each night brought growing desperation. Families waited for news that didn't come. Media began arriving, setting up cameras and requesting interviews that police declined. The story was spreading beyond the local area, attracting attention from outlets that saw in the disappearance a narrative that would resonate with audiences, a remote location, a missing person, a community in anguish. These elements combined to create the kind of story that generates engagement, that prompts sharing and speculation. The discovery came on the fourth day, though discovery is perhaps too clean a word for what occurred. A search team working through a particularly dense section of woodland found evidence that shifted everything. Not the person themselves, not yet, but belongings that were immediately recognizable, items that had been with the individual when they disappeared. The location was notable for several reasons. It was not along any established path or popular route. It was not a place that someone would stumble upon by accident. It required deliberate navigation to reach, a choice to move away from easier terrain into an area that offered nothing of obvious interest. The discovery triggered immediate intensification of the search. Additional teams converged on the location. The area was secured as potential crime scene. Every decision now carried new weight, new implications. This was no longer a search for someone who might be lost or injured. This was potentially the investigation of something far darker. The person was found less than 200 meters from where the belongings had been discovered. The condition of the body, though details were never publicly released, made clear that this was not accident or misadventure. This was homicide, deliberate and brutal, occurring in a place that seemed impossibly remote for such violence. The immediate aftermath brought chaos disguised as procedure. The area was cordoned off with tape that seemed absurd, stretched between trees in the middle of nowhere. Forensic teams arrived in vehicles unsuited to the terrain, struggling to reach the location with their equipment. Every item had to be photographed in place, catalogued, collected, with care to preserve potential evidence. The body had to be examined where it lay before being moved, a process that required specialists traveling from distant cities. All of this took time, hours that accumulated into another full day, while family and community waited for information that authorities couldn't yet provide. The investigation that followed became one of the largest ever conducted in the region. Detectives from major incident teams took control. Resources that normally went to Edinburgh or Glasgow were redirected north. The case attracted this attention not just because of its severity, but because of its location. Violence on this scale wasn't supposed to happen here. The contrast between the crime and the setting created intense pressure for rapid resolution. Political figures issued statements expressing shock. Police leadership promised that everything possible would be done. But promises don't alter facts. The facts were these: a person had been murdered in one of the most remote locations in the United Kingdom, and the circumstances suggested planning rather than impulse, deliberation rather than rage. The search for who had done this became complicated immediately by the same geographic factors that had hindered the search for the victim. Potential witnesses were few, cameras were non-existent. Mobile phone data, which often provides crucial timeline information in urban investigations, was largely unavailable because coverage in the area was so poor. The investigation had to rely on traditional methods: door-to-door inquiries, appeals for information, reconstruction of movements based on physical evidence, and witness statements. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, anyone who had been in the area during the relevant time frame, anyone who had seen vehicles or individuals, anyone who had noticed anything even slightly unusual. These interviews generated volumes of information, most of it irrelevant, but all of it requiring assessment and follow-up. The process was methodical but slow, grinding forward through accumulated detail rather than leaping ahead on breakthrough discoveries. Forensic analysis of the scene provided some information, but not the kind of decisive evidence that television dramas suggest is always available. There was physical evidence, certainly, but linking it to a specific individual required a suspect to test it against. Without that, it remained data waiting for context. Days became weeks. The initial surge of media attention began to fade as other stories captured public interest. For the family, this fading was perhaps the cruelest part. Their loss remained absolute, but the world's attention proved temporary. Investigators continued their work, but the pace slowed as obvious leads were exhausted. The case entered a phase common to complex investigations: steady grinding effort without clear progress. Detectives returned to the timeline repeatedly, looking for gaps they might have missed, inconsistencies that might reveal significance upon closer examination. They reviewed surveillance footage from locations miles away, trying to establish vehicle movements that might connect to the crime. They chased down tips called in by members of the public, most of which led nowhere, but all of which had to be investigated because the one piece of information that breaks a case often comes from unexpected sources. The community struggled to process what had happened. Memorials appeared at locations connected to the victim. Gatherings were held where people shared memories and tears. But underneath the grief sat something more unsettling. Fear. If this could happen to someone here, in a place that had always felt safe, then safety itself was revealed as illusion. People began locking doors that had never been locked before. Parents restricted children's movements in ways that would have seemed paranoid mere weeks earlier. The collective trust that had defined the community's character was damaged in ways that would take years to repair. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not from forensic science or brilliant deduction, but from persistence and luck in equal measure. A detective reviewing interview transcripts noticed a small inconsistency in one person's account. The detail was minor, easily explained, but something about it felt wrong. Further investigation revealed additional inconsistencies, statements that didn't quite align with known facts, gaps in timeline that couldn't be adequately accounted for. The individual had been interviewed early in the investigation as part of the general sweep, but hadn't generated particular suspicion. Now, with accumulated information providing new context, questions emerged that demanded answers. When brought in for further questioning, the person maintained composure initially. Answers were provided for every question, explanations offered for every inconsistency. But as the interview continued, as pressure increased and contradictions were highlighted, the story began to fracture. Details changed, new information emerged that contradicted previous statements. The moment of collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no theatrical confession, no breakdown into tears and admission. Instead, there was simply a cessation of denial, a quiet acknowledgement that the lies could no longer be sustained. What followed were hours of recorded interview, producing a statement that would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. The arrest generated immediate media attention, bringing back reporters who had moved on to other stories. The identity of the accused created shock for those who had encountered them. This was not someone with an obvious history of violence. This was not someone who fit comfortable narratives about what dangerous people look like. This was someone ordinary, someone who had moved through the community without generating alarm, someone whose capacity for violence had remained hidden behind a facade of normalcy. The details that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of calculated cruelty. The crime had not been impulsive. It had been planned with care, exploiting the victim's trust and the location's remoteness. The choice of site had been deliberate, selected specifically because discovery would be delayed, because help would be distant, because the isolation that made the Highlands feel safe also made them vulnerable to someone willing to exploit that vulnerability. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution assembled its evidence. Physical evidence from the scene, testimony from witnesses who could establish timeline and opportunity, digital records that contradicted the defendant's account of their movements. The accumulated weight was substantial, but legal proceedings moved slowly through their required stages. Months passed between arrest and trial, time during which the community remained suspended between trauma and resolution. The trial itself became a focal point for regional attention. Courtrooms designed for routine proceedings struggled to accommodate the number of people seeking access. Journalists filled the press gallery. Family members sat through days of testimony that forced them to relive the worst moments of their lives. The prosecution presented its case methodically, building from physical evidence through witness testimony to the recorded admissions that formed the centerpiece of their argument. The defense challenged what it could, questioning the reliability of forensic methods, highlighting gaps in the evidence chain, attempting to create reasonable doubt through emphasis on what couldn't be proved with absolute certainty. Legal proceedings have their own rhythm, their own rules, and criminal trials are not designed to provide emotional satisfaction. They are designed to test evidence against standards of proof, to ensure that convictions rest on more than assumption or desire for closure. The process was exhausting for everyone involved. Days in court were long, filled with technical testimony that required concentration to follow. Legal arguments over admissibility of evidence created delays that frustrated observers who wanted simply to reach a verdict. But the machinery ground forward, and eventually all evidence had been presented, all arguments had been made, all that remained was for the jury to deliberate. The verdict, when it came, brought a kind of resolution, but not the kind that restores what was lost. Guilty on all charges. The sentencing followed, with the judge delivering remarks that acknowledged both the severity of the crime and the aggravating factors, particularly the exploitation of the victim's trust and the vulnerability created by the remote location. A life sentence with a minimum term that ensured decades before any possibility of release. The family made statements outside the courthouse expressing relief that justice had been served, but noting that no verdict could return what had been taken from them. For the community, the conclusion of the trial marked a turning point, but not an ending. The fear that had taken root in the aftermath of the crime did not simply vanish with a verdict. The knowledge that violence could occur here, that remoteness provided opportunity rather than protection, that trust could be weaponized, all of this remained as permanent alteration to the collective consciousness. The changes that began immediately after the crime continued to evolve. Community groups formed to address safety concerns. Discussions began about improving communication infrastructure, about increasing police presence, about what might be done to prevent something similar from occurring again. What the case revealed about the system extended far beyond this single incident. The investigation had exposed fundamental limitations in how policing resources are allocated and deployed. When something serious occurs in a remote location, the response requires pulling resources from across an entire region, sometimes from neighboring regions as well. This works for single incidents, but it's not sustainable. Every officer traveling north to work on the Highland case was an officer unavailable for their normal duties elsewhere. The investigation consumed thousands of officer hours, straining budgets and leaving other areas under-policed for months. This reallocation was necessary and appropriate given the severity of the crime, but it highlighted an uncomfortable reality. The system was not designed to handle major incidents in remote areas without creating significant downstream effects. The specialized capabilities required for serious crime investigation, forensic analysis, major incident coordination, these were all concentrated in urban centers. Deploying them to the Highlands required time and money, creating delays that could prove critical. In this case, the victim was already dead before the investigation began, so delays in mobilizing resources didn't affect outcomes in that sense. But it raised questions about other scenarios. What if the crime had been different? What if speed of response could have saved a life? The geography that makes the Highlands beautiful also makes them challenging to police effectively, and no amount of good intentions changes that fundamental truth. Communication failures during the search and investigation illustrated another systemic problem. Different agencies, police, mountain rescue, ambulance service, operated on different radio frequencies and with different protocols. Coordination required physical meetings or phone calls rather than real-time information sharing. This fragmentation created inefficiencies that wasted time and risked duplicating effort or leaving gaps. In urban areas with integrated control rooms and shared communication systems, these problems are largely solved, but extending such systems to remote regions requires infrastructure investment that competes with many other priorities for limited funding. The result is that rural areas make do with patchwork solutions that work adequately most of the time, but reveal their inadequacy when tested by unusual circumstances. Mobile phone coverage, despite being identified as a critical gap for years, remained inconsistent throughout the region. The business case for network providers to invest in rural infrastructure is weak because population density doesn't generate sufficient return. Government subsidies could address this, but require political will and public funding that must be balanced against other demands. The victim in this case might have been able to call for help if coverage had been better. That possibility, impossible to confirm but equally impossible to dismiss, haunted many of those involved in the investigation. The protocols followed by police during the initial response were designed for more common scenarios. Missing person cases usually resolve quickly, either because the person returns on their own or because they're found safe after brief searching. The procedures optimize for these common outcomes, which means they can delay recognition of more serious situations. The hours that passed before the case was treated as potential homicide were hours that might have mattered had the victim still been alive. This isn't criticism of individual officers, but recognition that protocols reflect statistical likelihood. Most missing person reports don't involve foul play. Most searches end without discovering crime scenes. Training and procedure naturally emphasize the common cases, but this emphasis creates blind spots when rare events occur. Officers working in Highland communities often operate with considerable autonomy, making decisions based on local knowledge and experience. This autonomy is necessary given the distances involved and the impracticality of constantly checking decisions with distant supervisors, but it also means that responses can vary significantly based on which officer happens to be working that shift. Standardization, which urban policing relies on to ensure consistent quality, is harder to achieve when officers work in isolation across vast territories. The system wasn't broken, but it was never truly built for places like this. It was adapted, modified, stretched to cover contexts it wasn't originally designed for, and in that stretching, gaps appeared. What remains unanswered haunts everyone who became involved with the case. The why, beyond the bare facts established in court, remains largely opaque. The defendant provided admissions sufficient to secure conviction, but never fully explained motivation. Some killings have clear motives, financial gain or revenge, or elimination of witnesses. This case offered none of these obvious explanations. The best understanding that emerged suggested opportunism combined with predatory impulse, recognition that the victim was vulnerable and the location was ideal for crime that might never be discovered. But this understanding feels incomplete. It describes what happened more than why it happened. The psychological profile developed during the investigation suggested someone who compartmentalized carefully, who maintained normal social functioning while harboring capacity for extreme violence. This duality is disturbing precisely because it challenges assumptions about recognizability of danger. People want to believe that threat announces itself, that violent individuals reveal themselves through behavior or appearance. And this case demonstrated that such reveals can be entirely absent, that someone capable of murder can move through society presenting no obvious warning signs. Questions about whether anything could have prevented the crime persist without satisfying answers. Should someone have noticed something? Should the isolated encounters where the defendant and victim crossed paths have triggered more attention? In retrospect, perhaps, but retrospect provides clarity that real-time experience lacks. Small anomalies only become significant when viewed through the lens of later knowledge. Before the crime, they were just noise, random variations in normal patterns. The community's trust-based approach to safety, which had worked for generations, was revealed as insufficient against someone who understood how to exploit trust. But what alternative exists? Treating everyone as potential threat destroys the social fabric that makes community life functional. The balance between appropriate caution and paranoid suspicion is difficult to locate, and its location shifts based on context and experience. The crime moved that balance point for everyone in the region, but finding the new equilibrium point required time and collective processing that was still ongoing long after the trial concluded. The victim's family struggled with questions that could never be answered satisfactorily. Why their loved one? Why that day? Why that place? The randomness of it, the sense that had any variable been slightly different, the whole trajectory would have changed. This was perhaps the hardest thing to accept. If the victim had left home 10 minutes earlier or later, if they had chosen a different route, if weather had been worse and discouraged the trip entirely, any of these changes might have meant they would still be alive. But life doesn't offer the ability to rewind and replay with different choices. What happened, happened, and its finality was absolute. Grief counseling provided some help, but grief of this kind, violent, unexpected, completely preventable, yet not prevented, resists easy processing. The family's statements about their experience emphasized not just loss, but the violation of having that loss occur in circumstances that felt so wrong. Their loved one had gone to a place they considered safe, to engage in activities they had done countless times before, and been killed by someone who should never have been there, who had no reason to be there beyond predatory intent. For the wider community, the permanent changes manifested in both concrete and subtle ways. Security cameras appeared on properties that had never had them. Neighborhood watch schemes formed in villages that had never felt the need for organized vigilance. People checked in with each other more frequently, established protocols for letting someone know when they were heading into remote areas, when they expected to return, where they would be. These practical adjustments made sense and likely provided some actual increase in safety. But they also represented loss of something less tangible, the ease of living without constant awareness of threat, the freedom to move through familiar territory without calculating risk. Children who had roamed freely found themselves facing restrictions. Parents who had previously trusted in the ambient safety of the environment now worried about worst-case scenarios that had transformed from theoretical to proven possible. The crime had demonstrated that violence could reach even here, and once that demonstration occurred, unknowing it became impossible. The media coverage of the case, intense during the trial and immediate aftermath, eventually faded as it always does. Journalists moved on to newer stories, national attention shifted elsewhere. But for those directly affected, the story never ended. It simply became their permanent reality, something they carried forward into every subsequent day. The family lived with absence that would never be filled. The community lived with altered sense of place, awareness that the landscape held memory of violence that would never entirely fade. The officers who worked the case carried it differently, but no less permanently. Cases like this one mark careers, becoming reference points that shape how future situations are approached and assessed. The exhaustion of the search, the frustration of the investigation, the relief of the successful prosecution, these experiences accumulated into professional memory that would influence decisions and judgments for years to come. The policy discussions that emerged in the case's wake generated more debate than action. Reports were commissioned examining police response in remote areas. Recommendations were made about resource allocation, communication infrastructure, training protocols. Some recommendations were implemented, others were shelved, pending funding that might never materialize. This pattern is common in the aftermath of major incidents. The will to change is present immediately following tragedy, but will fade as time passes and budgets are set, and competing priorities assert themselves. The structural problems identified by the case, the fundamental challenges of policing remote regions effectively, these remained largely unresolved because resolving them requires sustained investment and political commitment that extends beyond individual budget cycles. The uncomfortable truth is that comprehensive solutions are expensive, and remote regions with small populations struggle to command the political attention necessary to secure those resources. The cost per person served is high when people are spread across vast territories. Urban areas, where resources can serve larger populations more efficiently, naturally attract more investment. This disparity is rational from one perspective, but devastating from another. The Scottish Highlands didn't lose their innocence because of a crime. They lost it because the crime was allowed to exist unnoticed. The failure was not the occurrence of violence, which can happen anywhere, but the gap between what the community believed about their safety and what reality had demonstrated. That gap was created by geography, by resource allocation, by the limitations of systems designed for different contexts, by collective assumptions about what remoteness meant and protected against. The crime exploited that gap with ruthless efficiency. It targeted a person in a place where help could not arrive quickly, where discovery would be delayed, where the natural advantages of isolation could be turned into weapons against the victim. This calculation, cold and predatory, succeeded not because anyone failed in their duties, but because the environment made success possible. The lessons from this case extend far beyond the Scottish Highlands. Every remote region faces similar challenges. Every place where population is sparse and distance is measured in hours rather than minutes struggles with the same fundamental problem of how to provide protection when the systems designed to protect were never calibrated for their geography. How many other places exist where similar vulnerabilities remain unacknowledged? How many communities operate on the same assumptions that proved insufficient here? How many people live their lives trusting in safety that derives more from luck and low probability than from any genuine protective infrastructure? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They require acknowledgement that universal safety may be an aspiration rather than an achievement, that some level of risk cannot be eliminated without fundamental changes to how we organize societies and allocate resources. The distance that hid everything in the Highlands continues to hide risks in countless other locations. The silence that seemed like peace can also be the absence of witnesses. The routine that creates comfort also creates predictability that can be exploited. None of this means that remote places should be abandoned or that fear should replace the trust that makes community life possible, but it does mean that assumptions require examination, that vulnerabilities need acknowledgement, that the price of remoteness includes challenges that cannot be wished away or ignored. The case that shattered one community's sense of security offers lessons that other communities might learn from, if they're willing to look honestly at their own circumstances and ask difficult questions about what safety really means in places where help is measured not in minutes, but in hours, where isolation is both blessing and curse, where the beauty of emptiness carries risks that go unspoken until the moment they manifest. What happened here wasn't sudden, it was unseen. And in being unseen for so long, it revealed truths that remain uncomfortable long after the verdict was delivered and the convicted killer was locked away. The Highlands remain as beautiful as they ever were. But beauty and safety are not the same thing, and confusing one for the other creates the kind of blindness that allows tragedies to occur in places where everyone believed they were impossible.